Arthur Kane sat at the sturdy pine table in his rented cabin, the dust motes dancing in the meager afternoon light filtering through the grime on the window panes. He was 43, though the lines around his eyes suggested a few more miles run on the odometer. A geologist by trade, Arthur lived a life of controlled variables and predictable pressures, but the world had begun to feel loose at the joints, rattling with a low, persistent frequency he could not quite place. His cabin, a glorified shed 65 miles from the nearest town with a functional grocery store, was his temporary center of gravity. It smelled of old, dry pine, the chalky scent of topographic paper, and the stale bitterness of coffee that had cooled 3 hours earlier. The maps spread across his table were the primary reason for his current restlessness. They were official surveys, but they had the worn, cracked patina of secrets kept too long. His assignment, a freelance contract for a private mining consortium, centered on a high-altitude sector known locally and ominously only as the 33 Pass. This area, long abandoned since the iron ore and coal played out in the mid-1930s, was being re-evaluated for trace elements. It was routine work, designed to fill out spreadsheets and justify tax breaks, but the geography itself resisted easy classification. Arthur ran a finger across a deep blue contour line representing an unforgiving drop-off. The pass was a spiderweb of old shafts and crumbling adits, the circulatory system of a sick organ, mapped poorly and forgotten quickly. He was skilled at piecing together the failures of earlier cartographers, bridging the gaps between the crude, hand-drawn lines of the early century and the sterile LiDAR scans of today. But one map, specifically, defied reconciliation. It was a brittle yellowish sheet, smelling faintly of mildew and coal dust, stamped 1909. Most of the hand-drawn features aligned with the general topography, but near the highest, most secluded point of the pass, where the granite became sheer and unforgiving, there was an anomaly. A thin, almost hesitant dotted line led away from a recognized drainage ditch and terminated abruptly at a marked rock fault. This exact feature vanished entirely on maps dated 1937 and onward. It was not just omitted. The geological markers suggested the area had been surveyed repeatedly, yet the fault and the path to it ceased to exist in the official record. This failure of documentation did not trigger Arthur's scientific skepticism. It triggered something far older and less manageable. It was a pure animal curiosity, the kind that makes a creature leave the shelter of the known woods. Arthur immediately dismissed the notion of simple cartographer's error. He concluded the omission was deliberate. The feature was hidden. He spent the rest of the afternoon sorting his gear, a ritual of organized dread. The equipment was heavy, functional, and imbued with the comforting scent of machine oil and pulverized rock. He checked the lanterns, 2 primary light-emitting diode units, capable of throwing a blinding beam for 500 yards, and a heavy brass-cased backup. Batteries were fresh Duracells, 6 pounds of reassuring energy. His geological hammer, worn smooth in places, felt like an extension of his own forearm, reliable and hard. He packed water, protein bars, and a first aid kit that included a heavy-duty suture set, things he needed in 58 miles of absolute solitude. The light outside began to fail, bleeding away from gold to a bruised purple, and the temperature dropped sharply, settling at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even though it was midsummer. Arthur built a fire in the small pot-belly stove, watching the heat bloom outward, fighting the chill that seemed to emanate not from the outside air, but from the granite heart of the surrounding mountains. As darkness clamped down, the quiet of the woods became something oppressive. It was not the natural silence of absence. It was the deafening quiet of something listening. He tried to read, a well-worn paperback detective novel, but the words refused to hold together. The image of that faint, dotted line, leading to nowhere on the 1909 map, was etched behind his eyelids. The anomaly was calling. Around 11 o'clock, he climbed into his sleeping bag, zipped tightly against the cold. Sleep was a distant, mocking promise. The pressure in the air was palpable, thick and static, the kind of charge felt just before a major electrical storm hit, the hair on his arms rising slightly. He lay there, acutely aware of the cabin's flimsy construction. He heard the usual sounds, the creak of the old wood settling, the distant hoot of an owl, the scratch of some small rodent working at the wall studs. But underneath those recognizable noises there was another sound carried by the breeze that worried the loose clapboards outside. It was a sound like wind navigating a constricted space. A deep, slow exhalation. Not a breath of air, but a compressed, muffled sigh, impossibly distant and yet undeniably present. It seemed to come from the pass itself, from the granite throat of the mountains, a sound of profound loneliness and patience. Arthur rationalized the sound, claiming it was a thermal updraft hitting a chimney effect in the nearby rock formation. But he knew the sigh was too rhythmic, too close to the human act of releasing pent-up tension. He pulled the sleeping bag tighter around his neck, wishing he had brought his short-barreled shotgun. He told himself he was a geologist, not a spook chaser. He dealt in hard facts and sedimentary layers, not the whispering anxieties of remote America. Yet the anxiety was winning. It settled deep in his stomach, a cold, hard knot that had not been there when he first drove into the pass. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the miles of empty, dark wilderness pressing in on the thin wooden shell of his cabin. He finally drifted into a fractured, restless sleep, just as the first bruised light of dawn started to paint the eastern ridge, haunted by the image of a line drawn over a century ago, guiding him towards something that the world had decided needed to be erased. He knew, with a certainty that curdled his coffee even before he brewed it, that he would be going to the rock fault that day. He would follow the dotted line, 58 miles of solitude ending right where the map said it should not. Arthur woke before the alarm, the remnants of the night's restless tension coiled tightly in his shoulders. He did not bother with coffee. The adrenaline already pumping through his veins was plenty strong enough. By 5:30 a.m., the air was sharp and cold, still well below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground was slick with heavy cold dew. He packed light but meticulously, confirming the presence of the light-emitting diode lantern, extra battery packs, the hammer, and the compass. The 1909 map, folded carefully into his waterproof chest pocket, felt almost alive. A blueprint to the forgotten. The drive was slow. He left his truck at the end of the maintenance road, a rusty sign declaring the land federal property and access strictly forbidden, a warning that had lost its teeth 50 years earlier. From there, it was a 2-mile hike through thick, low-lying undergrowth. The ground was a mess of decaying biomass and slick slate shale. Every step was a commitment. The wet leaves under his heavy leather boots made a sickening, sucking sound. A damp, persistent squelch that seemed to mock the effort of quiet movement. The air was incredibly heavy, saturated not just with moisture, but with a deep mineral scent of ozone and crushed green plants. It tasted metallic, like licking a cold, wet coin. He followed the landmarks designated on the old map: a triple-forked stream, a stand of enormous lightning-scarred hemlocks, and then the unforgiving upward slope of the final ridge. The higher he climbed, the thicker the moss grew. It coated the northern faces of the granite, a velvety, luminous emerald green that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. And then he found it. It was not a cave mouth, nor a slump pit left by a collapsed tunnel. It was a fissure, a vertical cleavage in a massive block of granite, just where the old map indicated the rock fault lay. It was impossibly narrow, perhaps 2 feet wide at the mouth, and nearly 20 feet high before the rock mass closed in above it. The entire entrance was heavily obscured, not by fallen debris, but by the same dense, plush moss. It covered the granite like a thick coat of velvet carpet, muffling the sound and softening the sharp edges. Arthur paused, his heart thumping a heavy, uneven rhythm against his ribs. Geologically, it was a sound feature, but the way the moss had taken hold, completely concealing the entrance, suggested a profound, undisturbed isolation. He knelt down, pushing aside a clump of the damp, cool moss. The air that leaked out from the crack hit him immediately. This was a dead, cold, stale, and heavy, carrying a trace of something bitter, something that had not seen the sun in an epoch. It was then he noticed the scratches. Near the base of the fissure where the granite met the soil, the moss was slightly scraped away. The rock beneath bore thin, shallow grooves. They were faint, easily missed, but unmistakably present. Arthur knew animal tracks. These were too deep for a deer, too chaotic for a climbing bear. They looked like something scraped by hard, sharp implements, dragged along the rock with powerful, deliberate force. They were not human, but they suggested hands or paws of immense size, trying either to pull something in or claw its way out. Arthur felt the cold curiosity turn to a sharp, anxious need for proof. He unclipped his primary light-emitting diode lantern, flicked the switch, and a column of pure white light stabbed into the darkness. The crack widened slightly after about 10 feet, forcing him to turn sideways and shunt his pack ahead of him. The granite was wet, weeping with cold mineral water. The light reflected off minute veins of quartz embedded in the slick rock. He felt the rough, cold friction of the stone grinding against his canvas jacket and scraping his knuckles. He tasted quartz dust between his teeth. The descent took perhaps 5 agonizing minutes of inching downward and forward. When he finally dropped into the first discernible chamber, the first thing he registered was the shift in acoustics. The outside world, the damp squelch of the leaves, the distant whine of the wind, vanished entirely. The silence that replaced it was pressurized, thick, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. It pressed against his eardrums, demanding sound and finding none. He stood in a roughly circular space, maybe 25 feet across and 12 feet high, the granite dome ceiling glistening. The air was utterly motionless. He swept the beam of the lantern around, searching for the telltale signs of old mining activity: drill marks, powder scorch, abandoned tools. There was nothing. This was a natural feature, untouched by industrial intervention. Arthur took a steadying breath, the inhalation sounding shockingly loud in the silence. He started taking initial readings, checking the ambient temperature, which hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and atmospheric pressure. Then, he focused the beam of the lantern down at the floor. It was littered with fine, cold silt, and the occasional scatter of fallen rock chips. But in one small area, toward the back wall where the chamber narrowed into another darker passage, he saw the imprint. He froze. The air seemed to crackle around him. It was an unmistakable footprint, massive, larger than any human foot he had ever seen, perhaps 18 inches long. It was distinctly five-toed, human in its overall structure, but unnervingly elongated and thin in the arch. The stone around the heel was slightly displaced, suggesting immense weight. But the toes, that was what stopped his heart. At the end of each digit, pressed into the cold silt and even lightly scored into the underlying softer rock, were faint, sharp indentations, not fingernails. These were the traces of claws, undeniably present. It was the footprint of a colossal bipedal being that moved with a frighteningly human gait. Arthur backed up slowly, the silence amplifying the frantic, desperate scramble of his thoughts. He dismissed the possibility of a large predatory cat standing up. The foot was too long, too thin. The sharpness, the anatomical specificity, defied the cold comfort of science. He was in an impossible place, led here by a line on a 100-year-old map, standing in the breathing silence of a sanctuary. Whatever lived here, whatever required this profound isolation, was vast, heavy, and walked on 2 feet, leaving behind the mark of a killing tool. Arthur raised his lamp, shining the beam into the passage where the imprint led. The light failed to pierce the depth of the gloom. The air there felt colder, heavier, and charged with a faint metallic odor he could not yet identify. He felt a deep, primal urgency to turn and run. But the geologist in him, the professional who must catalog the impossible, took one halting step forward. He needed to know what organized those bones, what left this mark. He felt a sudden, profound awareness of his own vulnerability. 65 miles from help, standing on the threshold of something outside the known world. Arthur pushed deeper into the cave system, the oppressive silence intensifying with every yard. The passage twisted sharply, descending into a second, much larger cavern. Here, the sense of geological structure gave way to something else, something disturbingly organized. The air in the second chamber was profoundly different. The dead mineral cold was still present, but layered over it was a sharp metallic tang. It was the scent of freshly spilled, rapidly drying blood on a cold surface, mixed with a faint but undeniable hint of sulfur, sharp and acrid, like struck flint. He moved cautiously, the lantern beam sweeping across the jagged walls. The rock face here was cross-hatched with deep uniform grooves. He ran his glove along one. The cut was deep, maybe half an inch, etched into the stubborn granite with inhuman strength and terrifying repetition. It was not erosion. It looked like something had spent years using the stone as a brutal, massive whetstone, constantly refining an edge. Then he saw the source of the organization. In the center of the cavern, the ceiling perhaps 30 feet overhead, was a massive, ancient fire pit. The stone ring was blackened and fused, but the contents had not biodegraded. The ash within lay in a perfect, neat circle, surrounded by a precise arrangement of bones. Arthur knelt, feeling a cold wash of nausea. These were not random scraps left by a scavenging animal. They were bleached white, clean, and meticulously categorized. Deer femurs in one pile, moose scapulae in another, bare ribs laid out like a horrifying curved fan. The larger skulls were arranged in a crescent along the outer edge of the pit. It was taxonomy, performed by a being that needed to understand the mechanics of its prey. This was not a lair. It was a morbid, subterranean laboratory. Arthur, trained to find patterns in the Earth's chaos, recognized the chilling methodology. The being that lived here was intelligent, dangerously so. It possessed the strength of a massive predator and the mental acuity of a collector. He stood, dusting the fine, cold silt from his knees. The sense of being watched, which had been a low hum of anxiety since he entered, suddenly amplified into a high, piercing whine in his nervous system. He turned toward the deepest, darkest recess of the chamber, where the light could not penetrate the gloom. He held the lantern steady, trying to force the beam further, but the distance was too great, and the air was too thick with shadows. And then he heard it. It was a sound that had no place in the heart of a granite mountain, a breath. It was a profound, slow, heavy inhalation, muffled by the dark, but close enough to make Arthur's lungs freeze mid-cycle. It sounded wet, deep, and patient. It was the sound of a very large, very powerful chest cavity expanding. Arthur pointed the lantern frantically, sweeping the beam across the boundary of light and darkness. He knew with sudden, absolute clarity that the creature was not merely in the dark. It was the dark, poised just beyond the threshold of his perception. For a split second, the edge of the powerful light-emitting diode beam caught a massive, too-tall shadow recoiling from the intrusion. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of density retreating into the comforting folds of the unlit rock. And in that moment, before the shadow was swallowed completely, Arthur saw the eyes. They were flat, depthless pools, devoid of any visible white, reflecting the pure artificial light back at him in a terrifying shade of yellow, amber, hard and cold, like polished resin. They held no warmth, no emotion, only a sharp, analytical focus that suggested immense, calculating hunger. The sound that escaped Arthur was not a shout of panic, but a stifled, strangled hiccup of sheer, paralyzing terror. The fear was so complete it short-circuited his professional discipline. The meticulous geologist vanished, replaced by the cornered animal. He thought only of escape. He turned, scrambling away from the organized bones and the terrible eyes. The heavy silence that had been oppressive now became a terrifying vacuum. He heard nothing behind him, but the certainty that the creature was moving, tracking him with silent, perfect speed, spurred him into a blind dash. He ran back through the first chamber, bumping wildly off the slick granite walls, the sharp corners biting into his skin. He scrambled into the narrow fissure, pushing against the stone, tearing his jacket on the quartz edges, desperate to reach the mossy mouth of the cave. He did not climb out. He clawed his way, spitting out quartz dust, his lungs burning with the stale, dead air. When he finally burst out into the cool, damp afternoon air, the change was nearly debilitating. The sounds of the forest, the rush of wind, the chirp of a bird, seemed ridiculously loud, an insult to the absolute silence he had just left. He did not stop running until he reached the relative safety of the logging road, gasping for air, leaning against a rough-barked cedar. His hands were shaking so violently he could not hold his water bottle. He was shaking not because he had seen a monster, but because he had seen something with the terrible patience of a machine and the chilling intelligence of a dark engineer. He had seen the custodian of the 33 pass, and the custodian had seen him, leaving him with the memory of those amber, flat eyes that seemed to know everything about him, including the precise moment his sanity had decided to jump ship. He knew he had left behind a meticulously ordered space, and he knew with cold dread that the organizing force was now aware of his intrusion. He drove the 65 miles back to the cabin on pure, distilled adrenaline, the metallic scent of the cave clinging to his clothes like a warning. Arthur spent the night trying and failing to convince himself that the amber eyes were an optical illusion, that the tracks were an elaborate hoax, and the organized bones were the work of a particularly meticulous pack rat. By morning, the sunlight falling across his dusty table felt weak and illusory, and the logic was crumbling. He had not slept, instead pacing the length of the cabin, the heavy static charge of dread still prickling his skin. The urge to return was not born of bravery. It was a frantic need for rational proof to defeat the existential horror. If he could prove the eyes were granite or quartz, if he could measure the bone piles and find a scientific flaw, he could reclaim his sanity. He decided to go back, but this time he would be prepared to document, not just observe. He traded his small flashlight for a professional-grade handheld camera rigged with military specification night vision optics and a highly sensitive directional microphone, all packed into a rugged, impact-resistant case. The drive back felt like a descent into a specific kind of hell. The forest was silent again, watching. When he reached the rock fault fissure, the air immediately felt wrong. It was colder than the previous day, and the heavy moss covering the entrance looked somehow thicker, more insistent. He tried to enter, but the narrow gap had shrunk. He had to wedge himself, the hard, abrasive granite scoring angry red lines across his forearms and hips. The earth itself had settled, contracting around the secret. Inside, the immediate change was chilling. The large footprint from yesterday was gone, swept clean, leaving only the fine silt. The chamber was sterile. He moved into the second cavern where the geometry of bones had held him paralyzed. The meticulously sorted anatomy piles were still there, but subtly rearranged, a minor correction. But where the fire pit had been, dominating the center of the chamber, the scene was entirely new. Lying neatly on the cold mineral floor was the fresh carcass of a large bull moose. It was an impossible weight of protein, over 1,500 pounds, dragged somehow through the narrow cave system. The size alone suggested crushing power. The horror, however, was not the brute force required to move the beast. It was the surgical precision of the preparation. The moose was pristine. There were no obvious signs of struggle. No fur was ruffled, no massive wounds marred the hide. The body was intact, yet utterly and completely drained. There was no blood. Not a smear, not a droplet on the surrounding stone, not even a stain on the pale fur. All the fluids had been extracted. It was as if the life had been sucked out, leaving behind a perfectly preserved empty shell. It was a butchery that transcended simple predation. It was an act of harvesting. Arthur's nausea returned, metallic and sharp. He felt a profound violation, as if he were witnessing a religious ceremony performed by a very old, very patient deity of the subterranean dark. Moving with feverish speed dictated by absolute terror, Arthur set up the camera. He He clamped the tripod to an uneven surface, aimed the lens at the mouth of the narrow passage leading deeper into the system, and started the recording. The night vision flooded the camera's viewfinder with an eerie green glow. He checked the microphone gain, adjusted the timer, and then scrambled back to retrieve his compass, needing to reorient himself before he lost control completely. It was during the brief moment he turned his back, concentrating fiercely on the compass bearing, east-northeast, leading deeper into the unmapped recesses, that his peripheral vision registered a flickering movement. It was only a shadow, swift and profound, passing across the mouth of the deeper passage. Too quick for his conscious mind to process, but enough to trigger an instinctive flood of panic. Later he would see it clearly on the footage. A fleeting dark silhouette, impossibly tall, unnervingly thin despite its bulk, moving with an arachnid quickness. Bipedal. Disproportionately long limbs. It was exactly where the scent of drying blood was strongest. Panic ripped through Arthur, shredding his veneer of professionalism. He grabbed the camera, not bothering to collapse the tripod, and bolted. He sprinted back toward the mossy entrance, his breath ragged. The world was reduced to the sharp stone under his feet and the overwhelming need for outside light. He did not see the break in the floor, covered expertly by cold silt. It was not a natural hole. It was a man-made shaft, sunk vertically by some ancient mining operation, dropped 60 feet straight down into the earth. Arthur's foot found no purchase. The world became a sudden, sickening tilt, a plunge into weightlessness. He tried to arrest his fall, grabbing frantically at the slick walls, but the momentum was too great. He did not scream. The air was knocked from his lungs immediately. He felt the cold, jagged teeth of the granite scrape his ribs, then a searing, tearing pain as his ankle twisted violently. The fall ended in a terrifying, shocking plunge into water, an ancient, stagnant, freezing reservoir that had collected at the bottom of the abandoned shaft. The temperature hit him like a physical blow, a sudden, debilitating shock, well below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He hit the surface hard, the impact driving the icy water up his nose and down his throat. He struggled momentarily in the absolute darkness, the frigid cold leaching the strength from his muscles. He managed to cough up the water, his panic fueled by the realization that he was trapped, floating in a granite chimney of icy oblivion, the cave system far above him. Then came the final paralyzing blow. As he blindly thrashed, trying to find a purchase on the slick black walls, his head struck a submerged rock ledge. The pain was brief, sharp, and incandescent. A blinding white light flared behind his eyes, followed immediately by the onset of a warm, spreading blackness. The icy water seemed to thicken around him, becoming a viscous, comforting syrup. The last sensation Arthur had was the taste of copper, and the dull, heavy certainty that the custodian of the pass was now fully aware that the intrusive geologist had eliminated himself, becoming just another unfortunate statistic in the deep, cold, empty places of the earth. Arthur woke up slowly, painfully. His first sensation was a crushing, rhythmic ache behind his eyes, followed quickly by the stabbing protest of his entire rib cage. He tried to suck in a deep breath, but the effort produced only a shallow, rattling gasp. He was not in water. He was lying on a dry, uneven surface, a bed of fine mineral silt, partially covered by dry moss and rough-spun fiber. The air was warmer here, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and surprisingly dry. Near his feet, a small, meticulously maintained fire glowed. It was an anomaly, clean-burning, hot, and producing almost no smoke. The light cast dancing shadows on the high, rough walls of a new, smaller cavern, a natural alcove, a sleeping niche. Arthur tried to sit up. A sharp, searing bolt of pain shot through his side, forcing a strangled cry from his throat. He looked down. His jacket was gone. His torso was wrapped tightly in strips of old, heavy fabric, canvas or treated leather. The bandages were crude but applied with a frightening efficiency, holding his suspected cracked ribs firm. His numerous cuts and abrasions, incurred during the fall and frantic ascent, had been smeared with something cool and viscous. He realized he had not eliminated himself. He had been retrieved. Sitting perhaps 5 feet away, cross-legged and perfectly motionless, was a man. He was gaunt, utterly overgrown, with hair matted and tangled, the color of dried peat. His skin was pale, the profound, lightless pallor of a creature that lives permanently outside the sun's domain. His clothing was a terrifying blend of natural materials. Shreds of cleaned leather, tough woven plant fibers, even dried animal gut, blended so expertly that he seemed to merge into the dark granite behind him. The man did not move. He simply watched. His eyes. Those same impossible amber eyes that Arthur had seen in the fleeting horror of the previous night were now close, unavoidable, and chillingly clear. They possessed a terrible, analytical sharpness. They were nearly devoid of human emotion, yet they conveyed an intense, relentless scrutiny. Arthur felt like an insect specimen pinned under a powerful, cold lens. The silence returned, but this time it was complicated by the soft, rapid thump-thump of Arthur's heart and the shallow whistle of his own breathing. The man made no sound. His stillness was absolute, a predator in a perfect state of repose. Arthur tried to speak. His throat felt dry and constricted. "No. Water," he managed to croak. The man blinked. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Then he rose. He did not use his hands for support. He simply unfolded, rising to a height that seemed preposterous in the confines of the small cave. He was massive, disproportionately long-limbed, and yet moved with a flowing, silent grace that betrayed his bulk. His posture was not relaxed, but constantly coiled, perpetually ready. He disappeared into the shadow of the alcove wall. Arthur heard the faint, dull scrape of stone on stone, followed by a heavy, guttural sound, a sound of exertion. He returned holding a smooth granite bowl, filled with clear, cold water. He knelt and held it to Arthur's lips. The water was impossibly cold, carrying the clean, mineral taste of the deep earth. Arthur drank greedily, the sudden cold shocking his system, pulling him back from the fog of concussion. When the man withdrew the bowl, Arthur looked into his eyes again, trying to grasp the human within the feral frame. "Who are you?" Arthur whispered. "What is your name?" The only response was a slight tilt of the head, a motion that felt less like a human questioning and more like a massive, alert canine catching a scent on a subtle breeze. It was a predatory posture of extreme focus. Arthur remembered the fresh moose carcass. He remembered the organized bones. He remembered the terrifying combination of feral power and meticulous intelligence. He was not saved. He was curated. The man sat down again, resuming his silent vigil. Arthur noticed something else about his eyes now that he was closer. The pupils were incredibly responsive, contracting and expanding with nervous speed even in the perpetual gloom, optimizing the intake of light. They were built for the dark. Arthur shifted his weight, testing the rigidity of the bandages. He found the man's gaze resting on his right hand, which had been gashed deeply during the fall. The wound was wrapped clumsily, unlike the precise binding of his ribs. He looked down and saw that the crude fabric wrapping was stained, a deep reddish-brown color, dry and flaky. It was fresh blood. But Arthur knew his own blood, and this was too dark, too dense. As he looked closer, he saw that the bandage had not just covered the wound. A small amount of the foreign substance had dried directly on the raw, open laceration on his palm, sealing it like a crude biological glue. It was not his blood. It was the blood of the creature, left during the crude, hurried process of binding his wound. A quick biological fix to stabilize the specimen. The realization settled over Arthur like a sheet of ice. He was not just near the creature, he had been physically exposed to it. He had shared something vital. He stared at the hand, at the dark, dry stain, and felt a profound chemical violation. The silence of the cave was now filled with the unspoken terror of absorption. The man remained seated, motionless, for what felt like an hour. Arthur, unable to move without searing pain, was forced into agonizing stillness, watching his captor. The temperature in the alcove was constant, dry and stifling, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature too warm for the rest of the cave system, suggesting geothermal heat or simply the intense concentrated warmth of the creature's own body. Then, the creature began to change. It was not instantaneous. This was slower, deeper, a subtle but relentless shifting of biology that unfolded with frightening reality. The man was still in his humanoid shape, but his shoulders thickened, pressing out against the rough hide covering. The musculature of his neck became cable-dense, straining the skin. Arthur watched as the blood vessels on the side of his neck began to throb, a complex, visible net under the pale skin, pumping an immense volume of life through the massive arteries. His face, already gaunt, sharpened. The bone structure around the cheeks and brow became more prominent, the chin jutting forward slightly. It was a refinement of the existing form, a tightening and hardening, optimizing the human shape for pure efficiency and strength. Arthur realized, with a sickening clarity that bypassed all rational training, that he was witnessing biological adaptation accelerated to its breaking point. This was a hyper-evolutionary response to profound isolation and specific environmental pressure. The creature was shedding the unnecessary softness of humanity, becoming something optimized, lean, and deadly. The changes were controlled, evidenced by the occasional subtle tightening of his jaw muscles, but the process was clearly reflexive, necessary. He saw the animal inside the man, and the horror was that the animal was utterly, frighteningly intelligent. The man reached out a massive, slightly elongated hand and tossed a small, porous chunk of wood onto the fire. The wood caught instantly, but the change in the fire was alarming. The flame turned blue-white, sputtering, and the dry wood scent was instantly replaced by that sharp, intense smell of ozone, the distinct electrical tang of a storm about to break. It was unnatural, a chemical reaction far beyond a simple wood fire. As the ozone washed over Arthur, a profound dizziness hit him. His rational mind, already fractured by concussion and terror, began to buckle. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to stabilize the overwhelming sensory input, desperate to anchor himself to the familiar dimensions of his life. When he forced his eyes open, the man had turned his back, facing the rough far wall of the alcove. His silhouette now seemed immensely powerful, a perfect inverted triangle of muscle. The stillness returned, but it was a loaded stillness, pregnant with unspoken force. Arthur lay there, his body aching, the strange metallic scent of blood and sulfur thick in the air. He felt a sudden, profound intrusion, a thought that was not his own. A complete, crystal-clear declaration dropped into the center of his exhausted consciousness. It was not a voice, but a weight of certainty, delivered without sound, without inflection, yet utterly undeniable. Now you are here. It was a statement of profound possession. It meant, now you are integrated into this place, into this system, into this silence. Arthur tried to fight it, pushing back with the remnants of his logical scientific self. I will leave. I will climb out and return to the city. The response, silent but immediate, was a deep, pervasive coldness that settled in his bones, a feeling of inescapable gravitational pull. It was the cave claiming him, filtering the world down to the cold granite, the organized bones, and the watchful amber eyes. He was the anomaly who had followed the dotted line, and the pass had absorbed him. The pain in his ribs and the fear in his gut were now secondary to the terrifying, growing sensation that he was merely a piece of equipment, stabilized and stored, awaiting deployment by the creature that now owned the geography, the history, and most certainly, Arthur Kane. He had been transformed from an observer into a component. The next morning, the creature was gone. Arthur did not know how long he had slept, but the fire was reduced to a mound of clean white ash, and the silence had returned, heavy and waiting. His ribs still screamed with every movement, but the bandages felt impossibly strong, and the cuts on his skin were already knitting together with frightening speed. He moved with agonizing slowness, testing his weight. His strength, despite the trauma of the fall, was startlingly high. It felt alien, sharp, and tightly focused. He found his compass and his pack. All his gear was stacked neatly by the entrance of the alcove, even the damaged camera. The creature had not looted him. It had prepared him. His escape was clumsy but successful. He found the path the creature had used to move the moose, a larger hidden passage leading up and out. He climbed, fueled by the borrowed energy in his veins, eventually reaching the surface where the rock fault was buried. The sunlight filtering through the dense canopy struck his eyes like shrapnel. A searing physical pain immediately followed, forcing him to shield his face. His pupils, adjusted to the deep gloom of the subterranean world, were brutally sensitive. His vision, however, was unnervingly sharp. He could see the intricate web of veins on a sycamore leaf 30 feet away with agonizing clarity. Then came the sound. The ambient noise of the wilderness, previously a comforting background hum, was now a full-volume, agonizing symphony. He heard the friction of the pine needles rubbing against each other in the breeze 100 yards away. He heard the infinitesimal chewing sound of insects working under the bark of a nearby birch. He could track the buzzing flight path of a mosquito 20 feet above him. The world was suddenly too loud, too bright, too real. The pressure on his eardrums was overwhelming, turning the peaceful forest into a riotous, unendurable sonic map. He clapped his hands over his ears, gritting his teeth, fighting the urge to vomit from the sensory overload. He walked toward where his truck was parked, maybe 2 miles away. His gait was steady, oddly light. He felt an intense, raw power pooling in his quadriceps, capable of carrying him at a speed he had never possessed. He was strong, too strong, and the strength felt borrowed, unstable. But with every forced step toward the road, a powerful internal counter-current dragged at his consciousness. It was an obligation, a profound, animalistic urge to return. The cave, the silence, and the amber eyes felt like the only logical center of the universe. The familiar world of his truck and cabin felt flimsy, temporary, a distraction from the necessary darkness. He pushed through the torment, eventually reaching the maintenance road. The walk was agonizing. He felt the minute vibrations of the ground transmitted directly up his spine, registering every fallen pebble and shifting layer of soil. When he finally reached his truck, he slumped into the seat, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. His hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the immense, unused kinetic energy coursing through them. He started the engine, the roar of the starter motor making him wince violently. He drove slowly, cautiously away from the pass, battling the physical symptoms of his altered senses. He noticed the smells next. He could detect the faint scent of diesel exhaust from a truck that had passed hours earlier. He could separate the clean aroma of fresh ozone from the deeper, rank odor of saturated, decaying leaves. And clinging to him, undeniable and pervasive, was the sharp, metallic scent of the creature's lair, mixed now with a faint, cloying sweetness. He knew what that smell was, the odor of his own blood, mingled with the dried foreign blood on his palm, now rapidly sealing the wound. He felt an acute, horrifying sense of invasion. His body was his tool. Now that tool had been violently upgraded, its software rewritten, its input channels maxed out. He was no longer Arthur Kane, geologist. He was a newly tuned instrument, violently attached to an unseen master deep within the granite. He had come to find a hidden passage, and instead he had become one. A week passed in the lonely shell of his cabin. Arthur lived in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of existence, but his true life was now elsewhere, located deep in the high granite ridges of the 33 Pass. He tried to ignore the pull, focusing on the sheer volume of data he needed to process from his legitimate survey work. But his body and his soul were already mutinying. The approach of the full moon, visible as an enormous cold disk starting its climb in the eastern sky, turned his nights into a special kind of torture. It was not a transformation in the mythical sense. Arthur did not sprout fur or gain claws. Instead, he suffered. As the moonlight flooded the worn floorboards of his bedroom, the pain began. A deep, crushing ache in his bones. It was a pressure that felt as though his skeletal structure was being violently coerced, trying to shift its geometry into something longer, denser, and more suitable for hunting, but failing, trapped inside the constraints of his human skin. His joints burned, not with inflammation, but with a profound internal nervous tension, controlled and modulated by a rhythm that was not his own. He realized the legend was backwards. The transformation was not the event. The resistance was. His human form was a prison cell, and the moon was the warden forcing the change from outside. It was during the peak of this agonizing synchronization, sometime past 1 a.m. on the night the moon hung highest, that the first jump occurred. He was lying rigidly, sweating despite the chill, when the ceiling vanished. It was a flash, intensely vivid, non-visual yet completely real. He was seeing, but not with his own eyes. He saw the ground. Wet, dark earth, compressed moss, and scattered pine cones, all rushing past at unimaginable velocity. The scent profile was overwhelming. Cold, dense dew, the sharp, sweet tang of disturbed resin, and underneath it all, the rich, musky, irresistible aroma of warm, breathing flesh, the pure, thick scent of wild prey. The sensation was terrifying, the weightlessness of speed, the feeling of ground blurring beneath colossal limbs, the absolute concentration of the chase. Then, just as quickly, the vision snapped back. Arthur was in his bed, gasping, the cabin silent save for the heavy, desperate beat of his own heart. His sheets were soaked. He understood instantly. It was a forced sensory feed, a fragment of the creature's current reality, violently grafted onto his consciousness. He was seeing through the amber eyes. He sat up, his limbs trembling uncontrollably, and looked at his right hand. The laceration, which had been crudely treated with the creature's blood, was now an angry, thin, reddish scar. It burned with a deep chemical heat, a focal point of nervous energy. The truth, ugly and final, solidified. The contact had not just been physical. It had been an act of deliberate biological grafting. The creature had tagged him. He had been inoculated. Arthur was not the werewolf, but he was tethered to it. He was the familiar, the involuntary sensory antenna, a biological receiver perpetually tuned to the pass, connected by a thread of alien deoxyribonucleic acid now woven into his own. He was the creature's far-seeing eyes, forced to witness the hunt, the silence and the eternal vigilance of the great coiled darkness that lived in the granite. His body was no longer entirely his own. The initial shock of realizing his role as a biological antenna gave way to a cold, frightening clarity. Arthur, the scientist, could not afford the luxury of hysteria. He needed to understand the mechanics of his new affliction. He began observing the link with the terrifying precision he usually reserved for geological samples. The connection was undeniably real, and it operated like a primitive, one-way communication channel, feeding input into his brain but offering him no means of control or response. First, the location. He could always feel the creature's presence. It manifested as a pervasive mineral coldness in his deepest bones, a psychic gravity well centered high in the ridges of the pass. It was accompanied by the faint, coppery metallic taste in the back of his throat, the creature's own ambient aroma translated chemically into his system. Next, the emotion. He received profound, basic, nonverbal broadcasts. He felt the creature's absolute hunger, a consuming, patient furnace that never fully dampened. He felt its perpetual state of high-alert caution, a constant low-frequency hum of watchfulness, screening the miles of forest for threats. Most powerfully, he felt the single-minded focus of the hunt, a biological imperative so absolute it transcended morality or distraction. His role as a forced witness was unbearable. He was trapped in the driver's seat of his own consciousness, but the navigation was being done by a powerful, alien intelligence. He learned to recognize the creature's danger signals. If the beast was unsettled, if something approached its perimeter that it did not immediately identify or trust, Arthur felt a scorching heat erupting at the base of his skull, accompanied by a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic ringing in his ears. It was a nervous system alert, a biological warning siren broadcast across the shared connection. His ability to differentiate odors had been violently enhanced. He perceived smells that were essentially meaningless to an average human. The sharp, volatile odor of fresh adrenaline, the sour, complex scent of fear, the subtle chemical marker of illness or infection in an animal 20 yards away. His domestic world was now an overwhelming, fetid landscape of hidden information. He experimented desperately to sever the tether. He drank heavy amounts of cheap, rot-gut whiskey, hoping to drown out the neurological connection. He took massive doses of prescription sleeping pills, seeking to enforce unconsciousness and silence. The result was only a terrifying internal dissonance. The human chemicals blurred his awareness, but the creature's signals, the bone cold, the hunger, the alertness, persisted, making the attempts at peace agonizing failures. The connection was physical, nervous, and profoundly chemical. It could not be broken by simple will or pharmaceutical intervention. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the alcove would impose itself. The smooth, ancient stone, the dry heat of the perfect, smokeless fire, the scent of fresh moose. It was the creature's home, and by extension, through the tether of blood and nerve, it had become his anchor, the fixed point around which his entire, fractured reality now spun. He was bound irrevocably to the silence and the dark. The constant low-level dread that had defined Arthur's life for the past few weeks exploded into acute, paralyzing crisis on a hot August afternoon. A small group of hikers had ventured too far off the beaten track and entered the outer perimeter of the pass. Arthur did not see them, but he smelled them. He was sitting in his kitchen, attempting to repair the damaged camera tripod, when a blast of sensory input hit him like a physical shockwave. It was the smell of human fear, pure and raw, mixed with the familiar sharp odor of sulfur and a faint, acrid tang of urine. The fear was so intense, so complete, that Arthur's own mouth went dry and his palate seized up. It was the absolute final terror of one of the hikers, somewhere high in a gulch miles away. At the exact same instant, a furious, hungry signal flooded the channel. It was a sudden, violent surge of imperative. Closure. Eliminate. Attack. The creature was responding to the fear signal with instantaneous, overwhelming focus. Arthur did not think. He reacted. His legs moved before his conscious mind registered the danger. He snatched his heavy-duty flashlight and burst out of the cabin, running toward the mountains. His body moved with the same impossible, flowing speed he had briefly felt during the moonlight visions. His feet found purchase on loose shale and sharp rock, propelling him effortlessly up the slopes. He was following the intense magnetic pull of the creature, now fully engaged in the hunt. As he ran, he saw the tracks. The ground was loose here, but the signs were unmistakable. Massive, five-toed imprints, deeply scored into the soil, heading toward the sound of a distant, muffled shriek. But intertwined with the creature's tracks were other smaller indentations. A strange, shuffling drag mark, like the gait of a severely afflicted animal. Arthur ran for perhaps 3 miles, his lungs effortlessly pulling in the thin mountain air, his heart rate controlled and efficient. The closer he got, the stronger the sickening mix of sulfur and fear became. He burst into a small, rocky clearing high up in a secluded canyon. The sight that greeted him was not the brutal scene of a monster feeding. The creature, now fully shifted into its optimized, massive bipedal form, its hide looking like dark, wet leather in the afternoon shadow, despite its imposing, crushing bulk, stood over a prostrate figure, a young man wearing torn hiking gear. The other hikers had fled, The creature was not tearing into the flesh of the victim. It was focused on the clothing. Its elongated, powerful hands were methodically ripping away the thick fabric of the man's shirt, exposing his chest and arms. And then Arthur saw it. The tourist was indeed a victim, but not of the monster. His skin, exposed under the creature's massive hands, was covered in strange, pulsing black lesions, oozing sores that looked less like infection and more like mutation. They were too geometrically perfect, too virulent to be simple disease. The creature raised one colossal hand, its clawed fingers flexing, ready to deliver the final, crushing blow. In that terrifying moment of frozen time, Arthur understood the horrifying truth of the pass. The creature was not hunting people for sustenance. It was a biological failsafe. It responded with overwhelming aggression only when it detected the severe chemical signal of advanced infection, of mutation, of biological corruption that threatened the fragile ecosystem it guarded. The creature was the ultimate, horrifyingly effective immune system of the wilderness, efficiently eliminating threats that had advanced too far. The tourist was biological refuse, a carrier of a sickness the earth could not tolerate. The logical horror of the revelation, that the creature was a necessary, functioning predator, not a malicious one, did nothing to quell the human outrage in Arthur. The thing was standing over a man, ready to end him, regardless of its ecological purpose. Driven by an instinct of preservation far older than his recent biological alterations, Arthur grabbed a grapefruit-sized rock from the ground and hurled it with all his unnatural, borrowed strength toward the creature's massive flank. The impact was negligible, a minor thud against hide and muscle dense as iron. But the interruption was absolute. The creature froze. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its massive head. The amber eyes, now reflecting the dull, filtered daylight, were fixed on Arthur. They held no wild frenzy, only a profound, readable frustration and intense, rational anger at the intervention. In that pause, the mental connection between them flared, violently intensifying. It became a bi-directional flashpoint, not a conversation of words, but a rapid, brutal exchange of understanding, purpose, and the cold weight of necessity. "Why do you interfere?" The question hit Arthur's mind like a hammer blow against rock. "You are different. You perceive the sickness. Why do you protect the contamination?" Arthur struggled to formulate a resistance. He is a man. There must be another way. Quarantine, medicine. The creature's response was immediate, cold, and final. No time, no cure. Balance requires elimination. Equilibrium is maintained with blood. The creature sent an image. The pass, healthy and green, contrasted with the image of a rapidly spreading, blackening rot originating from the infected man. The beast held its position for another agonizing second, its analytical eyes assessing Arthur, the familiar, the compromised antenna, the one who should understand the law of the deep woods. Then, recognizing the immediate futility of forcing the issue against its own connection, the creature dropped its massive head, offered a final, heavy exhalation, and simply retreated. It did not run. It flowed. It dissolved into the dense shadows of the ravine, leaving behind only the hot metallic scent of ozone and the heavy aroma of disturbed earth. The tourist was left, severely traumatized and with the strange black lesions bleeding sluggishly but alive. Arthur knelt by the man, checking his pulse, the stench of sickness and sulfur heavy in the air. He knew the man's chances of survival, even with medical help, were slim, given the aggressiveness of whatever was consuming him. The creature's intervention was necessary. After the creature's retreat, the internal link settled back down, but it was profoundly different. Arthur felt the cold presence of the past deeper now, more intimately woven into his own nervous system. He realized the true, terrifying permanence of the bond. If the creature were eliminated, the resulting withdrawal, the severed sensory connection, would be catastrophic. His own newly altered nervous system, now reliant on the creature's baseline frequency, would collapse. He had become a symbiote, biologically reliant on the thing that should have killed him. Arthur drove the tourist's abandoned car 60 miles down the mountain road, dropped the man near a small, isolated hunting cabin where he was found, and then turned back toward the pass. His purpose was no longer exploration or escape. His purpose was to maintain the secret. He was the bridge. He was the sentinel. Arthur returned to the rock vault. He did not enter the cabin again. He found a secluded, dry spot near the fissure, took his remaining equipment, and waited. His place was no longer in the sunlight world of maps and rational science. It was here on the threshold, guarding the silence and the hunger. 6 months bled into the next year. Arthur Kane had not only survived, he had distilled. He was thinner, tougher, the unnecessary softness of his civilian life burned away. His movements were precise, quiet, governed by the relentless alertness transmitted through the bond. He still wore his old clothes, but they were expertly mended and hardened with natural resins and mud, blending him into the landscape. He lived in the periphery of his old life, using the dusty cabin as a supply depot, but his true home was now the rough edge of the pass, constantly orbiting the epicenter of the cold gravitational pull. The scar on his hand was now a thin silver line, a perfect silent seal. A new contract came through from the same mining consortium, a formal, legally mandated follow-up survey of the miscellaneous rock faults in the old sector. The team was small, a senior surveyor, a younger geological technician, and Arthur, the local expert. Arthur met them at the maintenance road. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady, focused, and deep-set. He led the team through the dense undergrowth, his gait effortless, silent. He heard the nervous, overly loud chatter of the young technician 20 yards ahead of the group, and beneath that, the steady, patient beat of the creature's heart. Half a mile away, deep in the earth, when they reached the coordinates-marked rock fault, where the narrow, moss-covered fissure had once gaped open, they were met by a geological impossibility. The granite face was whole. It was a sheer, monolithic wall, smooth and unbroken, save for the natural crystalline grain of the quartz. The moss was gone. The fault was erased. The stone looked solid, fused into an impervious barrier. It was smooth, hard, and cold, a finished surface that spoke of millennial repose. The younger technician, perplexed, checked his modern global positioning system unit against the historical markers. He scratched his head, a nervous habit that Arthur heard clearly. "Where's the entrance, Kane? The map shows a clear cavity here. We need to measure the displacement." Arthur walked forward slowly, placing his hand flat against the cold, unyielding granite. He felt the faint residual vibration of the ceiling, the echo of the creature's incredible controlled power. The secret had been successfully and completely buried. The custodian had closed the door. Arthur turned back to the confused men. His face was devoid of the anxiety that had marked his previous existence. His voice was low, perfectly calm, and stripped clean of conversational warmth, carrying the strange, resonant quality of stone speaking. "It is sealed," Arthur stated. "The vault is closed. It sleeps now." He did not elaborate. The surveyor, a practical man focused on the clock, merely shrugged and started marking the spot as stabilized. Access impossible. Arthur stayed by the granite for a long moment, feeling the cold, silent communication of the deep. He was no longer running. He was watching. As he finally turned to follow the crew back down the mountain, the late afternoon light caught his profile. Beneath the line of his ragged hair, barely visible on the side of his neck, was a thin, perfect, silvery scar, shaped exactly like a claw mark, the final healed trace of the original traumatic contact. He blinked, shielding his eyes from the weak descending sun. And in the brief, involuntary flicker of his eyes, a reflection caught the light. Not the dull brown of human sight, but a fleeting, cold flash of undeniable deep amber.